People call this like an oil change for the blood.
On average, the patient got 2.6 years of biological age reduction and 3 months of. We're finding plastics in carotid arteries, and we're finding plastics in cranial nerves. And those patients are having a more preponderance of strokes and heart attacks. So we're hooking you up to a machine where we're taking out your whole blood out of one arm. At that point, we are targeting taking off plasma and then replacing it with and some other substances like. I talked to a patient who, had long COVID and was basically back at work.
The only thing I can say with certainty was I slept like a rock, way deeper than a typical night's sleep.
We're seeing this inversion of aging within the US population.
Thanks for coming down to Optispan today. It's great to see you again. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So a lot of people out there have probably never heard of Therapeutic Plasma Exchange. If you had to explain it as simply as possible, how would you explain that?
So we're hooking you up to a machine where we're taking out your whole blood out of one arm. We're basically putting it in a large centrifuge with a computer where we can separate the blood into its main components by density. At that point, we are targeting taking off plasma, therefore the Therapeutic Plasma Exchange terminology, and then replacing it with something else. In our case, we're replacing it with albumin and some other substances like calcium and so forth. But that's the primary methodology of what we're doing with TP or Therapeutic Plasma Exchange. It's the same machine you'd use if you were going to your local blood center to give platelets or red blood cells. The same machine is separating out the density of the whole blood, and then you can take out what you want to take out, and you can actually leave the rest in there. So,
and maybe just for people who may not know what we mean when we say plasma, what are we talking about there?
So if you take your whole blood and you look at it, you're going to have your platelets, which help the clotting. You have your white blood cells, broadly speaking, signs of infection. If you're checking your white blood cell count with your primary care doctor, we have hematocrit, which is looking at our hemoglobin, which will look at your red blood cell count levels. And then there's everything else kind of floating in the background there. And so there's a bunch of interesting cytokines and inflammatory molecules and immunomodulatory molecules and proteins that live in that space. And that's kind of what sits in the plasma. And so that's the area we're targeting as it relates to the procedure and longevity specifically.
Got it. Yeah. And we'll dive into more why you would want to do this as we go throughout the conversation. So I'm interested though, you've spent your career as an ER physician, a combat physician, which is super interesting. I'm sure you have lots of stories there. And now you've gone into the longevity field. Why did you feel like this technology was something you wanted to devote your energy to going forward?
Well, when I was in the Army, I got involved in tech procurement on the battlefield. So that was my big aha moment, and moved into like digital health. It was called mHealth back then in the early days. Did 3 companies that were all hardware-based, ultrasound machine. I was at Q Health as their CMO doing microfluidics, outpatient, home testing platforms. Then I went for 8 years into like AI primary care. That was a great experience there, the local company called 98.6 in Seattle.
Right.
And what we learned from that experience, what I learned was that you could build really interesting technology, but the second layer is human behavior and patient engagement, which is really critical for anything you're trying to do in healthcare. So I decided that for my next experience, next venture, if you will, I wanted to move directly into longevity to work with a population that was highly engaged in their health, and what kind of technology and product could we build around that. And so Circulate had done this trial with Eric Verdin as the co-founder, and I was sort of brought in to sort of take that research and commercialize it. I was really compelled by the data.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that, I'm sure. But it was like the team that was already kind of assembling with Eric sort of at the helm there as the president and CEO of the Buck. So this idea of building a company branded in science and grounded in science was very compelling to me. I'm a physician, so that's an important part of what we're doing. And so that idea that we could get out there and really present real data to the community was another part of what was really exciting with this particular opportunity.
Right. And yeah, I mean, you said, the science is very compelling. I think a lot of people who've heard about, Therapeutic Plasma Exchange, or even if they haven't heard of that, they'll have heard about the vampire blood exchange and, taking blood from kids and giving it to old people, which sounds like science fiction to a lot of people. So what would you say to them is most compelling about the science in your view? And let's take that as deep as you want to go. What do we know about the science of therapeutic plasma exchange that makes it seem like this is a really compelling intervention to think about?
Yeah, I think there's two things to touch on. We'll talk about the science first, then we'll touch on the regulatory environment, which
Okay.
you always have to respect a bit,
Yep.
as I know you do, and think about
Yeah.
think about and talk about a lot on the show. So from the science perspective, this all comes back to the rat parabiosis studies out of Berkeley,
Right.
With Conboys and others, looking at plugging up the circulatory systems of young and old rats that are relatively similar otherwise genetically, and noticing from repeated experiments that the young rat was getting older through that blood transfer and exchange. And more importantly, the old rat was phenotypically getting younger. And so the idea was, based on those foundational research models that were repeated multiple times, could we create a human approach to this where we could actually impact aging potentially, or the way I like to look at it is healthspan. Everyone wants to live a healthier life, higher quality of life. Right. And so that was where we translated that data and said, let's do a human trial, which ended up being the Circulate trial. From a methodology perspective, we really wanted to make sure what we would test would ultimately be something that could be accessible in a regulatory environment in the United States. So one of the things that we thought was limiting from the sort of young plasma exchange was there's some things to consider there as far as allergic reactions, of course, communicable disease, which is minimal, but not zero.
And let's just explicitly talk about that for a minute. So, in the rat experiments that you alluded to, you're essentially going both directions, right? You're taking young blood and putting it into an old animal and vice versa. And I think what you're saying is, in humans, taking young blood or young plasma and putting that into aged people has some unique challenges, right, in terms of safety and regulatory, whereas the plasma exchange doesn't. Am I getting that right? That doesn't run into those challenges.
Yeah, they're certainly, like, it's not a statement about the potential impact of plasma, although we don't have really any significant longitudinal data to suggest it's better than plasma exchange, or worse for that matter.
Right.
But beyond that, it didn't seem like a particularly scalable
from a pragmatic perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. From a health and pragmatic, we're trying to make people healthy, not increase risk. So was there an easier way, a way that wouldn't take on those same kinds of risks, where we could still get significant and really impactful results in patients, where they would feel safe, and we could get the data to prove that, which is what we did.
Right. And so let's talk a little bit about the animal studies, just for a minute, so that everybody has an understanding of what this is based on. So you mentioned the rat studies, and then there have been a bunch of studies in mice as well. And in my view of that literature as a whole, right, one thing we can be pretty confident of is you can increase lifespan in the old mice or rats through parabiosis. And then this question of, is it really slowing aging or reversing aging? That's harder, I think, to nail down. And I'd be interested in your thoughts. But my feeling is certainly people have shown improvements in cognitive function, heart function, some areas of muscle function. So at least in those domains, it seems like there's pretty good evidence that this exchange of circulatory factors improves function in the aged animal at the same time that it makes function worse in the young animals. That kind of line up with what your understanding is of the primary literature, and then what might be possible for therapeutic plasma exchange in people?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good way to look at it. And generally, even in humans, how I frame it, which is, if you're living a healthy life, chances are you're probably going to live longer than if you lived an unhealthy life.
Sure. Yeah.
It's a basic tenet. And so the idea is, if we can improve your muscle strength, cognitive ability, of course, that's a better health span, a better quality of life, and will likely lead to a bigger opportunity to live longer. Although, that, as you said, is really difficult to ascertain in rats or mice, let alone humans. There's no great human studies that are actually following patients out like what you're doing with the dog
study. It would take a long
study.
time to do those kinds of studies.
So we don't have that data in really anything, frankly. So focusing on, let's take care of the things we know. We think if you're stronger, retain your core body strength. If you do all the things you need to do with diet, sleep, and exercise, and then whatever else we can come up with from an intervention perspective, that we can improve that health span. And even if you only live to 100, most people I've talked to over the years since I've taken this job certainly are like, yeah, I'd like to live, if I'm going to live to 100, I want to live to like 99.9% of that time with a very high quality of life. So I think we all could agree that's
absolutely
a good goal.
Yeah. So I mean, we'll get into more some of what you're looking at with TPE, but if you had to pick, what is one thing where you feel like there's the best opportunity for therapeutic plasma exchange to show an improvement in people, what would that be?
It's a great question. I mean, we looked at a lot of stuff, and we'll go into the details on the actual trial. But I think one of the areas I'm really interested in right now is furthering the science around cognition, which we're in earlier stages with that, but we obviously have the ANBAR trial, which looks specifically at that, which had relatively encouraging results. And with the aging population, we have this issue around, dementia, a variety of dementias, Alzheimer's, and otherwise, as you mentioned, I'm an ER doc. And so I still like to touch patients on the weekends, in the ED setting. Yeah. And I think it really helps me keep in touch with what's going on with patient care, but also with like what's going on in terms of the community or just healthcare in general. And we see a significant aging population, higher acuity patients, all that. If you look at the data related to ED visits, which is really a nice marker of what's going on in society, because when people don't know what to do, they go to the ED if they have no other resource available to them. And so it serves as a good place for us to look at what's going on with healthcare in the United States and abroad, whether it's preventive care or care related to the aging population. So I think that notion, and then also if we can really continue to do research looking at what's the impact on muscle or other factors, immune factors, which could be important for improving healthspan or reducing the decline in a patient, those are incredibly important areas to look at.
Right. Yeah, I think for me, the thing that got me interested in therapeutic plasma exchange was the data on cognitive function. The first time I saw that, and I'm like, oh, this looks pretty compelling. And then thinking about, other things that plasma exchange might accomplish, like diluting out toxins or microplastics, which we'll talk more about. That's kind of, added on, but it was really the potential effects on cognitive function. So you mentioned the trial. Why don't you take us through, like, what was the design there? What did that look like? What did that suggest?
Yeah. So the design was 3 arms of patients who were actively getting plasma exchange. And then we actually had a really interesting, I think, elegant way to look at a population that didn't get anything. So we called it the sham arm. And so the machine was draped behind, the machine was behind a drape. And the machine was turned on. So patients really couldn't tell. And then their IV line coming out of one arm and then the IV line coming back into the arm were covered up. So patients couldn't tell if they were getting real plasma exchange or not. And a small amount of blood was drawn out of the line in the arm so you could try and mimic it as much as possible. And that really provided a control group, I think, in a way that, frankly, has never been done, certainly with plasma exchange.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, this is worth just double clicking on, because if people were to think about how would you do a placebo in a trial where you have, blood coming out of one arm and then plasma taken out and then coming back in the other arm, what's the placebo for that look like? And it sounds like you guys did as close as you could probably come to that, where you actually had people hooked up, they had the IVs in, they just weren't getting the exchange, but they didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And people generally wanted it. So we had to sort of like take care of that after the study. But,
and I think it's also probably worth mentioning explicitly, this is the kind of procedure where I think people would be susceptible to a placebo effect, right? As many things are, right? So again, trying to control for that as best you can is really important. So it's good that was built into this design.
Yeah, and there's some subjective changes. People feel better more often than not from it. Not everyone, for sure. And so we definitely wanted to try and control for that factor. So yeah, and then the 3 arms within the trial, we just did sort of different frequencies. One arm, patients got plasma exchange on a Tuesday and Thursday, essentially twice in a week. They came back a month later, did that again, and they came back a month later and did a third time. The second group did essentially the same thing, but after the treatment, they got a small dose of IVIG, and we can dig into that if you want, but that's very interesting. And the idea was you are taking out some immunoprotective agents, to put it sort of broadly, with the procedure, and we'll just give them a little bit of hemoglobin back. So for the first couple of days after the procedure, maybe there's some additional protection there, although that's unclear if that's really needed. Frankly, most of the time that's not done. Right. And just for the listeners, like the dose we're using at 2 grams is quite small from a clinical perspective for what we would typically use in the hospital.
The dose for the IVIG.
Correct. Yeah, very small. We oftentimes will refer to as a whiff. Like it's just not a big dose.
Right. So IVIG is intravenous immunoglobulin.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. It has It's better to call it intravenous immunoglobulin, really, because there are IgM and IgA in it. It's just a predominance of IgG.
Right.
So people think it's just an IgG boost, but it's actually it's not completely distilled in that way.
And where does that come from? Where does the immunoglobulins come from? Those are from donor samples?
Yeah, those are human derived, similar to the albumin we use as volume replacement. If you go to donate blood at the local blood bank, typically you're taking out a small dose, 500, 650 milliliters of blood, and they're just replacing with normal saline, like the same thing you get if you went in the hospital and they're giving you fluid replacement. We're taking out a more significant amount of your plasma. And so we wanted to look at different fluid substances, which could, we're using the fluid essentially as a replacement for your blood pressure and so forth. That's what the machine calculates safely. This machine's been used for 20, 30 years. So that was nice too. It wasn't new technology on the machine side either. And then the albumin, also interesting to the point you just said about the IVIG, is also human derived. I think the average age when I looked last was about 24 in the US. So although it's not considered a blood product with the same risks of plasma transfusion, there is human derived. There's also synthetic albumin. We're using typically human derived albumin, and the study used that, and that had a benefit as well, we think. And there's potential that has a role in this as well.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to optimize for the best outcomes.
Yeah, I was going to mention, there is early but interesting data on albumin itself, potentially as a therapy in laboratory animals for increasing lifespan and at least some healthspan metrics. So it's interesting to think about whether just the fact that there's albumin in the replacement component of TPE, could that have benefits in addition to diluting out whatever bad, quote unquote, bad stuff is in there?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that would be an interesting study to do in humans. It wouldn't be particularly complex to do.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll tackle that down the road here.
So let's go back to the trial though.
Yeah.
So you have 3 arms, placebo arm built in. So what happened in the study?
Yeah, the third arm, just because I hadn't mentioned it, was once a month for 6 months. So a little bit different cadence.
Okay, so everybody got the IVIG as part of the...
No, only one arm. One of the 2 arms that did it twice a week for 3 months got IVIG. Okay. So one was with, one was without. The third arm was once a month for 6 months.
Got it.
So the 2 groups were done essentially in 3 months.
Okay.
The other group was essentially going to be going for 6 months.
Got it.
And so, and the trial looked specifically, I got 3 cohorts of data, I call it. One was the objective measures. So every time they come in, we would look at grip strength, balance. We call it get up and go. And you sit up from a chair and walk 6 feet. Things like that. Cognitive function as well, interestingly, to try and capture relatively objective data that's been reported.
And how did you measure cognitive function?
There were a couple different scales we used on those patients to test them for. And so they would get the same repeated testing methodology every time.
And did these people come in were they all normal coming in, or did they have any impairment in cognitive function?
They were all relatively normal, over 50 years old, not a ton of chronic disease. So we're interestingly pre-selecting out of that in the trial, although we actually have data and interesting conversations around chronic disease as it applies to this therapy as well.
And again, maybe just as an aside, it's worth mentioning that's one of the challenges with a trial like this, because if you set up your criteria, your entry criteria, where your population is too healthy, you might miss the benefit from an intervention. So these are the kinds of things I don't think until somebody's designed a clinical trial, you really think about the impact of the way you design the trial on the likelihood that you're going to see an outcome. It's much more challenging when you're dealing with something that's not a disease endpoint, right?
Yeah, totally. I think 50 was a good choice based on the data we've seen around that sort of exponential bump in aging around that time. So it was like a good pick retrospectively for us, I think, from that perspective. And I think it was good we didn't confound with too many like significantly chronic disease oriented patients.
Sure.
That would have really made it complicated.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be nice to get that data moving forward, which we actually are. And we can talk about that later. But as it relates to trial, relatively healthy, 50-plus-year-old, both males and females. And we took them through the trial. I wish we could have followed them for 5 years. Of course, that would have cost more money than we probably could have supported. But we were able to get a nice cohort of data with that in partnership with the Buck to really report out. So that first area was really interesting. We haven't published all of that in paper format yet around the impacts of grip strength and cognitive function. But just to say, those were interesting and will be published and looked very encouraging. The primary issues that were put in the first paper that we did publish last May was around the second 2 groups. So one was we called the omics. So we needed the buck in partnership for that. Obviously, we took the samples in the Bay Area and shipped them up to Novato at the buck in partnership with David Furman, who was really leading a lot of the work with David, as you know. And we looked at omics, lipomics, proteomics, all the standard omics, like 2,400 different markers on every sample. It's really, now it exists as probably the largest plasma exchange data set, certainly in the world, as it relates to the amount of data we're able to get from these patients pre and post.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when are the samples collected in this?
They're typically, when they come back, they're typically collected when they come back for their next plasma exchange before they get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's right before. So your baseline is going to be before the first session.
Exactly.
And then how often again were they coming back?
Well, the 2 cohorts were coming in twice a week for 3 months.
Okay.
And then once a month for 6 months.
And did you get samples at every time point?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Great.
And so that we were able to look at that, and we go into the details there, but obviously we were like looking for phenotypic changes that we would hope to see in patients that would be living healthy lives or improving healthspan, looking at cellular senescence, whatever.
Right. Reduced inflammation.
Exactly.
And probably we're saying David Furman is one of the world experts in how immune function and chronic inflammation changes with age in humans.
Yeah.
So it's a great person to have doing those studies.
Yeah. I love surrounding me with people that are a lot smarter than me. So
it's a good strategy.
He's one of them. And, when I walked in the door and we were doing the study and getting it all set up, it's like I get to work with some of the best and brightest humans around in this particular field. And it was, a great education for me as well. So yeah, he did a great job managing the trial from that perspective. So that data was really interesting. We can dig in there. And then the last cohort of data, which, I think is a topic near and dear to your heart, are biological age tests.
Right. So we're talking about the methylation test in particular. Yeah.
So we didn't know what to do with that, but we thought the best approach was let's just do everything. So I think it was 36 clocks. We ran it against every patient, same thing, and kind of see what we would see from that.
Yeah.
And I thought that data was actually really interesting. We talk about it, and that was also reported in the Aging Cell paper in May of 2025 that we published.
So what are the take homes on the findings from the study?
Yeah, I think that the phenotypic omic changes we would hope to see at the broadest level were kind of what we saw in patients. Improvement in inflammation, improvement in biomarkers, improvement in sort of things we would expect with healthy living. If you dig into the paper itself, it starts to translate some of those omic changes to basic blood lab biomarker testing we have, creatinine, impacts on platelets, things like that. So more common things people are testing in themselves on a regular basis. And how does that translate to some of those omic features? Yeah. So that was really interesting. And then, of course, the biological clock testing, which seems to get the most conversation, was interesting. On average, the patient got 2.6 years of biological age reduction and 3 months of therapy across all 36 clocks.
And again, I know you know this, those things don't actually measure biological age.
Yeah.
Methylation age, I can stomach. But I mean, I think they are, as you say, I think they are correlated with mortality, at least most of the clocks. And so to that extent, I think it's intriguing to see directionality going towards what you would expect to mean reduced risk of dying. Like that's a good thing. Yeah. And some of them are trained on other features. So, and probably also we're saying, I'm assuming that the methylation analysis was done at the buck or So again, one of my concerns with the methylation clocks, the way they're applied today, is much more on the direct-to-consumer side and not knowing what the direct-to-consumer companies are doing. I think as research tools, when used in that context, they're really interesting and potentially informative.
Yeah, David's team put it through AI models. We try to do our best.
Right.
I agree with you. Like, I don't go around talking about my biological age on podcasts. Personally,
you get more clicks if you do that.
I know, I'm not good at that. But I do think it's interesting to say, okay, we have a certain state, a biological state, we apply an intervention, then we observe again. And whatever that intervention is, and it can give you some clues as to the impact of that intervention.
It's actually interesting to think about. I know Eric Verdin has done some of the best work in, what is the impact of the fact that most of the methylation age studies are done on blood-based samples, and if you change the composition of the cells that are present in a person through interventions or whatever, that could impact the perceived or estimated biological age, just because you've changed the proportion of different types of cells. Now, I don't think therapeutic plasma exchange would be expected to change the proportion of different types of cells present in the sample. But was there any, I mean, did you guys talk about that, or did Eric bring that up in conversations? I'm just wondering if that was part of the discussion around estimating the methylation age.
Yeah, I think that, no, we didn't go that deep. He may have had a conversation that I wasn't part
Sure.
of there,
Yeah,
for sure.
Of course. Yeah.
But I think the idea was, let's just take a look at these,
Mhm.
since it's a common currency in the space,
Yeah.
and just add it on to the trial.
Right.
Really focusing. I mean,
Right.
the big investment financially and time-wise was the omics. That
Yes.
took the most money, time, and
Right.
energy to get those blood samples shipped up. And
Right. The other thing I wonder about is I'm much more bullish, at least right now, on the clinical application of these estimators like lineage, which use clinically relevant biomarkers. Did you guys look at that and try to, do you know what lineage is? Sorry, I'm throwing these terms up, but this is a mortality predictor that Jan Gruber and Brian Kennedy and folks at NUS came up with. But it uses parameters from NHANES, including some survey questions, some stuff from urinalysis, and stuff from basic blood work.
Yeah, no, we didn't do that because I think when the trial started 2.5, 3 years ago.
Yeah, again, this is all moving
at
the speed of light. Yeah.
The good news for us is we have a bunch of samples frozen at the Buck.
Yeah.
So we actually just submitted samples with one of the new next gen companies, and I'd like to continue looking at some of these new clocks and new methodologies that are coming out, since we have the data, both the blood data and otherwise. And we have their lab data as well, right? We know these patients. So
in the lab data, what sort of biomarker changes have you most encouraged, or have you, what are the kinds of changes that seem encouraging among the lab work?
Well, I think if we look at like the basic set of labs that most people are getting now, obviously you can get many more, as you know, but I try and keep it as simple as possible for, I have friends that are getting plasma exchange and they're like, what should I be getting?
Sure.
I'm like, you don't need to get 1,000 tests every month. Like, you can if you want, but it's probably not necessary. I know some people may disagree.
Well, let's talk about that. Like, what do you think are the things people who want to look at their biomarkers and they're doing therapeutic plasma exchange, what should people think about measuring?
Yeah, I do it myself, and I monitor biomarkers. I do simple ones and I do more complex ones. But some of the ones that I'm focused on are, and I had curiosity around when I started plasma exchange, was what's the impact on lipids? And we know for sure its impact on ApoB and LDL and very broadly across lipids, which makes total sense.
And is that, in your estimation, just a dilution process? So
no,
basically, right after therapeutic plasma exchange, you're going to have lower levels of these things because of the dilution?
Yeah. I mean, I'm following my lipids out. I think just generally it's creating a lower baseline level for me. I don't think it's we know this works in different disease processes, obviously in the hospital, which is where this machine has garnered all of its scientific and safety data. Historically, patients with a little bit different methodology, but generally the same, with familial hyperlipidemia syndrome, are coming in and getting exchanges to get the lipids out of their bodies.
Right. And that's what I was getting at. I mean, that's what I'm asking. Is it just a dilution, right? Because especially in that case, you've got super high levels, right? Yeah. And because you're pulling out, I don't know, is it 80%, 70% of the plasma, you're going to drop down 70% of your lipids that are in the plasma, right? Is that do you think there's anything beyond that? I guess it would be a better way.
That's a fair question. Now I understand. Yeah, no, I think it's probably a primarily dilutional effect. We haven't gone deeper into that to understand if there's things happening with plasma exchange that are impacting lipids and the baseline levels. What I found is that it's a way to lower them further than I was doing with statins, when I was being as aggressive as I could with statins, and I was looking at PCSK9s and other opportunities to lower it further to the level that I wanted to target, which we'll leave out of this conversation.
Yeah. But I mean, I think in general, right, the concept makes a ton of sense. It's kind of like with toxins, if they're present in your system. And if you have very high levels of some of the bad lipids, you could think of it as a toxin that you're just diluting out.
Yeah, totally. 100%. And we're looking at toxins. We can get into that as well. Yeah. But I also look at my homocysteine levels as a marker of inflammation in my body and others. So that's one I've seen significant improvement in patients. Just as a general marker for inflammation, getting some additional reduction beyond I'm taking methylfolate to try and reduce it. And so that's interesting. So it certainly, I think, goes beyond just dilutional impact, but I think that is certainly a core principle of what we're doing. We're taking out a lot of bad stuff and then providing a dilutional impact as well. And then if patients are generally living healthy, it's like, does this overall improve their health span by getting ahead of the game as far as obviously, as you know, one of the things we are looking into now is what is everyone's reaccumulation rate?
Yeah.
Whether it's toxins, microplastics, or anything else. Lipids, and this is a whole area that no one's ever really looked at, frankly.
Right. Okay. So, so lipids, basic blood work, anything outside of the basic blood work you would point to that you're monitoring as you're going through the TPE cycles?
I mean, I'm doing mostly just basic panels on a regular basis. Yeah. I mean, obviously we're giving you back your platelets and your red blood cells. So those are not changing very much at all from this procedure. But I think creatinine, one of the things we know from the translative data that David's team put together is we see a correlation with proteomics, metabolomics, and creatinine levels and platelet count levels and things of that nature. So in other words, the proteomics we'd expect to see in a phenotypically healthier people, they have lower creatinines. That makes sense. We know people who have lower creatinines have better GFRs,
unless you're taking creatine and you're one of those people whose creatine boosts the creatinine.
Yeah, then you need to get your cystatin
exactly.
level.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, and that's what I feel bad for my primary care doc sometimes. I'm like, because I'm like, you need to get me a cystatin level. You need homocysteine.
Yeah.
And
sorry guys, we went off in the weeds a little bit, but if you've seen my episode on creatine and creatinine, in some people, creatinine is not a great measure of kidney function or EGFR. Cystatin C is a better metric.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a great episode because it's not known by the common primary care physician, honestly. And there's a ton of people taking creatine who aren't even quote longevity patients. They're just in the gym.
Yeah, of course.
They're in the gym.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of benefits to it. But I think so I appreciate that episode.
All right, cool. Okay. So I want to go back to the trial because we kind of got off on this tangent. So you had generally what you would consider positive outcomes in terms of biological age assessments or methylation age, omics, and at least some of the biomarkers going in the direction that you want to see them go. Mm-hmm. Was that the same across groups? Was there any difference among groups that you're able to point to at this point?
Yeah, I think that from an omics perspective, there wasn't necessarily significant differences, interestingly. There was a little bit on the biological clock side, and there's some graphs in the actual paper, which you can just pull up online. It's available, publicly available. And technically the best cohort was the one that got IVIG after the treatment. So 2 treatments a week for 3 months, followed by that small dose.
Methylation age.
You're correct. Yeah. Exactly. So for whatever that's worth. I mean, we didn't follow patients out. What's interesting is the group that didn't have the IVIG had slightly worse methylation aging. So that was kind of interesting. Like my theory on that is, well, there's probably some point where it's too much. And that may be variable for patients. Like there may be a frequency which maybe is more than you need. And
you mean too frequent of the TPE?
Correct.
Itself.
I mean, it's a big centrifuge and there's probably some inflammation happening, from that, a mild inflammation. There just may be too much. We don't know for sure, but it certainly seemed to near off as far as additional benefit. What's interesting is sort of, if you looked at the biological clocks, the second best group, which may, if you look at like statistical significance, may not be really any different than the cohort that got IVIG for 3 months, was just once a month for 3 months. So like sometimes some rest time, some reaccumulation time, things of that nature. If you look at clinically what's happening in hospitals historically with plasma exchange, some patients are coming in getting it 2 or 3 times a week, and for multiple weeks for that matter, trying to get out. There's this whole thing in the plasma exchange community called compartment theory. So, and we have a lot of interest in this theory because we're taking out a bunch of your plasma. And in the example of the trial, you come back 2 days later. Well, why are you doing that? Well, you have some reaccumulation of substance in the bloodstream. It's not just newly generated. It's thought that you're actually able to pull things out of the interstitial fluid, out of soft tissue.
Right.
And so you can get some additional benefit from that second procedure potentially.
Right. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that idea. So, I mean, you've mentioned a couple times that this procedure has been used in hospitals for decades, right? It's an FDA approved procedure. I think that's important to state. So can you talk a little bit about what it is typically used for or has been used for historically?
Yeah, I mean, so my remote background is emergency medicine, so we didn't really have to, fortunately, deal with this too much in the ED setting. But we did have patients who came in with ascending paralysis, who Guillain-Barré syndrome, who could benefit from that. There's other, obviously, I mentioned the familial hyperlipidemia syndrome.
Is it FDA approved for that
It's
use?
The one machine is FDA cleared for plasma exchange.
I see.
and
So
apheresis.
so the device itself is what's FDA
Correct.
approved, not the use
Right.
of it.
Now, what's interesting is, like if, and I don't remember exactly about the Fresenius machine because we use the Terumo machine, so I have more knowledge about that. Okay. But the second clearance they got with the FDA was around sickle cell disease. So they have like this very broad clearance and claim, and then they have a second one which is specifically around sickle cell.
Yeah, let
disease.
me understand that. So first of all, I guess I should be using the word clearance, not approved.
Yep.
So it's a device clearance by FDA for clinical use, and then so you can get a clearance that's just a general clearance, meaning this device can be used in the clinic for anything, and then you can get specific additional clearances for specific uses. Is that how it?
You can. I mean,
works?
There's different strategies that companies will go to the FDA, and obviously, my time at Q Health as their chief medical officer, we were trying to bring an at-home testing kit pre-COVID out. So there's a bunch of conversations you have to have about that, and it's very expensive to add additional clearances. So many companies will be like, we have a broad one out there. Why go back and spend the money?
Just like if you're approved for an indication and it can be used off label for
exactly. And this is no different, which is if a physician feels that the treatment will be beneficial for the patient's disease process, they can prescribe it as an off-label use. And so that's the approach that is done even in hospitals with some diseases that don't have clearance, Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, you name it. So there's other blood diseases and things where you're trying to take things out of the blood, which are commonly known. ASPHA, American Society of Apheresis, which is really the knowledge base for this field. They have guidelines and recommendations and different like levels of data and said, we don't know much about this, but it's probably good. And, there are indications where this could be really beneficial. Right. And so those are the true heroes of this field, nurses and physicians and others who have spent their careers figuring out what are the potential benefits to this sort of apheresis and plasmapheresis is like the high level broad name, and then plasma exchange is one methodology that the device is used for.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, I'd love to sort of dive into the different uses. And I mean, some people I've heard people call this like an oil change for the blood, right? So I mean, like we run with that analogy. What are the things in the oil, right, that are being taken out? And we already talked about what might be put back in. And in this case, it's albumin and IVIG, but what are the things that are taken out that are likely to be most problematic for a general population, right? So we talked about some of the specific, conditions where you have toxin buildup, but what are the things you guys think are most beneficial to remove?
I mean, I think what my perspective on this is evolving as I sit more time in the seat here as the CEO.
And it's probably worth saying, like, we go back to the parabiosis experiments in mice and rats. Like, there have been people in the basic research world trying to find the factors that are causing the differences in health and lifespan for decades, right? Yeah. With pretty mixed results. Like, I don't think there's any smoking gun at this point. There are a few candidates, but it's a hard problem to nail it down.
And I mean, we couldn't say confidently which disease process this works for at scale versus other ones. Now we have lots of data we're collecting. One of the things I didn't really appreciate from taking this job was the amount of physicians who were passionate about plasma exchange and the future of it. I call it sort of a renaissance coming of plasma exchange. A really interesting way that I sometimes describe what we are is we're essentially now, surprisingly, only 2 years in, the largest outpatient plasma exchange company in the United States. That's not saying we're not that big, but just to say that it's been really an in-house procedure other than blood centers when you're donating blood. This would be the only other significant outpatient equivalency. So there really is an opportunity to take this, and patients are excited about it. And, and the other thing is there's lots of patients who have disease processes that are very debilitating where there's no answer for. There's some trials going on in Europe looking at plasma exchange for long COVID. There actually was an interesting one that came out looking at just, is there any age testing difference or biological age difference if you just donate plasma?
Yeah.
That's a
Right.
question I always get.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, let's just address that now, because that's one that I hear all the time.
Yeah.
So let's assume TPE has all these benefits for longevity and healthspan.
Yeah.
Can you get the same thing from just donating blood regularly?
Well,
or donating plasma?
I read that study on the flight to Radfest, which I know you've
we'll come back and talk about Radfest. Yeah.
But on the way there, I saw the study just come out from Europe. And to that point, when my friends would ask me, I'm like, if you have the phenotype of blood that you can donate plasma, which not everyone can donate plasma, it depends what they need. In Seattle, like my blood type, I'm not able to give it right now. So I couldn't even do it. But if you could, I was like, it's better than nothing and it's free. So go for it. And there's people that have gone that approach, which I think is a fine approach. And the problem is that a lot of those N-of-1 experiments aren't getting all the data to know, is this really working?
Sure.
Broadly speaking.
And so how frequently or how many times would you have to donate plasma to achieve the same volume that you get from one TPE?
Well, that's the key, right? Even if you're coming in once a month and giving 650 milliliters and replacing it with normal saline instead of albumin,
which is what typically would happen.
Right, exactly. Just get saline because it's not a high volume exchange. So you can just use saline. It's not a big deal. Saline's a lot cheaper than albumin.
Right.
Another reason, so it makes good sense for blood centers to be operating that way. And even if you're coming once a month, you're still not nearly approaching the plasma volume that we're taking. So we do, as you mentioned, like try and take out around 1 full plasma volume. So that's around 75 to 80% of your plasma.
Right.
That's safe, but it's just not necessary when you're donating plasma and not part of their standard protocols. So it is really not comparing apples to apples there. But even that being said, when the study came out that I read, it showed there was really questionable whether there's any benefit to doing plasma donation. They basically were following patients at plasma donation
And this
centers.
again was using methylation age as the readout. Yeah.
For the most part.
Yeah.
But they had, even from that perspective, arguing the value of these methylation clocks aside, if you just compared it to the Circulate trial and said, well, whatever it is, let's just see if it's different or the same. It was quite different. It didn't show that same significant impact that we saw with plasma exchange. So now the question is there any value? I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time ruminating over, but I think that paper was interesting to say, well, maybe there isn't just with donating plasma.
Or at least it's not detectable based on that particular assay.
That's a more scientific way to place it. Thank you very much.
Okay. So anyways, I want to come back to like, what are the things that might be being taken out that it's a good thing to get either diluted out or removed? In your mind, what are the things you're thinking about?
Well, one of our patents is around the removal of cellular senescent cells from the body. Interestingly, that's one of the ones we've got baked and done.
And do senescent cells come out in the plasma exchange?
Yeah, that's what we were able to demonstrate with our data and get a patent around that.
And why is that? Why do the senescent cells, why are they removed when other cells aren't?
Well, we are removing other cells too, I think, but at scale, there's some impact there, it looks like. So
preferentially for senescent cells.
Potentially, yeah. Okay. That's what the data kind of appears like, but I can't say for sure how preferential it is. But from the perspective of how do you target, or this notion of senolytics, some interesting potential there based on what we're seeing in the data.
And I would imagine, independent of the cells themselves, a lot of the inflammatory factors that senescent cells give off will absolutely be diluted in the plasma exchange.
100%.
Yeah.
Interleukins, whatever we other looked at, that's all reported on the paper. We said positive benefit. Like, we would like to see this go down. Did it go down? Yes. Great. And so that was also really encouraging for us from the data. So,
and I think the thing about particularly the inflammatory mediators, there's always this question in my mind, like we have a set of things we can measure that are associated with what we would consider poorer health. Like creatinine's a good example, right? It's probably not the creatinine itself that's problematic. But it's a biomarker of impaired kidney function, right? Whereas I think the inflammatory mediators, there's good reason to believe that those themselves, when present at suboptimal levels or in the wrong context, do create problems, right? And so that, to me, that's a very plausible thing you might want to reduce, right? So
that makes good sense.
So that makes sense, yeah. What else is in there that you think are beneficial to dilute out?
Well, I think that other toxins are in the body, certainly. And so this is a bunch of work we're doing now. Now that we've built this, we call it our affiliate clinic network across the U.S. and soon to have a number of clinics abroad. One of the things I'm most excited about the whole approach we're taking is just data collection. Like, data collection at scale that's never been done around plasma exchange. Answer the questions with scientific rigor around what's happening in the blood. And so, without going into some of the details, because we're doing work different clinics we're working with have different interests. And so we can work broadly with our whole clinic network on projects like we are with the micro and nanoplastics that we'll get into. And we also have one-off projects with specific clinics. They have a population that's high in toxin X, and we'll just leave it at that for now. But and we're looking at, well, what does plasma exchange specifically do as it relates to that? So toxins, heavy metals, you name it, that data set we are actively collecting and building a data warehouse around.
Is it the case that the plasma exchange is already been used or being used for people who come in with very high levels of, say, mercury or something like that, as an acute sort of get it down quickly?
Well, there's other medical approaches to some of these heavy metal reductions, which typically aren't plasma exchange. I think if you look at the ASFA guidelines, you can find some of them discussed in that. But the reality is, how do you get it done? Like if you had high mercury level and you're like, I want to get it done, you're not going to be able to go in a hospital and get it done,
right?
Because they operate under this sort of payer system,
right?
Where's the codes?
You got to go get the insurance approval. That'll take 3 weeks. I
mean, we probably won't even get approved. Frankly. So that's the state of affairs we've lived in, and
got it.
That's what's great with the longevity and the functional medicine partners we have. They're really focused on these areas. Like there's just never been a company that could come in and partner with them to answer these questions scientifically. So that's what we're out to do.
And actually, I mean, you sort of alluded to this, but it may not be clear to an audience that isn't, in the weeds on plasma exchange. Historically, this procedure has really only been available within hospital systems for specific use cases within that context. And one of the things that Circulate has done is been able to place these devices with expertise in a variety of outpatient clinics, which then gives people access to this procedure outside of that hospital acute care or reactive care context, right? Is that a fair way of
absolutely
saying
I mean, as I mentioned, it's so early. Like we probably are servicing, I don't know, 90+% of the clinics that are doing this in the country right now.
And ballpark numbers, how many are we talking about at this point?
We're close to cresting towards 40.
Okay. So it's a pretty,
I mean,
it's a pretty small number.
It's just not, and there's, I mean, one of the things that's interesting and exciting to me is there's just no shortage of demand.
Right.
There's really good clinics with really good clinicians leading the way who are seeing what's happening in the plasma exchange data and would like to get involved. They believe it will be helpful to their patient population. Not just longevity clinics, but chronic disease clinics.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing I think that's worth probably saying is this is not a procedure that is solely in the domain of longevity. In fact, maybe it isn't even in the domain of longevity, but there's lots of other potential places where there's value to people being able to get access to this kind of a procedure.
Yeah. I mean, before I decided to take the job, one of the due diligence things I did was interview patients who were getting it. The majority of those, probably 80%, were chronic disease patients. And the stories kind of blew my mind.
Yeah. And what chronic diseases are we talking about typically?
I mean, there's a whole variety, but an example would be I talked to a patient who, had long COVID and was basically come back at work.
And is the thought there that because long COVID is primarily a chronic inflammatory condition, that plasma exchange is going to be beneficial in that context, or is there more to it?
No, I think that's it. I think it's okay. I mean, as you know, we don't really know how to define what long COVID is per se. But it was just that narrative and that story. Like I'm back at work. Yeah. Like I would never miss my plasma exchange. Like I am back at work. The brain fog is gone. And I always hesitate to tell those stories because I recognize it's an N of one story.
It is, but it's just like with rapamycin, right? When you start to hear enough of these anecdotal N of ones around certain types of conditions, it really gets to be believable. Like you're okay, that's probably real.
Yeah. And then as I got into the space, started reading about chronic diseases and plasma exchange, I realized there's not a lot of data. It's too anecdotal. And there's a bunch of patients who believe it in who are just coming in and getting it, predating even me being in this field. And this is what we are focused on, is gathering that data. We want to answer, as it relates to cognitive function, are there certain kinds of patients that it really is beneficial? If it's not a cheap procedure. And so you shouldn't get it then per se. But so we're not out, as you know, we're not out on the social media areas talking about things that we really can't support. We haven't even released our plastics.
Getting the influencers to make ads about, how they went in for their TPE.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't even released the plastics data yet, even though we've talked to most major news outlets. Why? Because it's like, we're going to come out when we believe there's enough data to tell a narrative there, a scientific narrative. Even though lots of people are asking us when we go to conferences, what's your data like? And it's like, well, I mean, we're obviously doing it because we're encouraged by the notion of taking plastics out of the body, since there doesn't seem to be any other option.
Right.
For,
Right. Yeah. No, and this is probably a good time to talk a bit about that because, we talked about inflammatory markers, toxins in the form of like metals and things like that. Another toxin people are concerned about are the microplastics, and so interested to hear what you can say about that, what you want to say about how TPE may have benefits in the context of microplastic levels.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two sort of things that blew my mind as a physician, like things where I was like, well, I didn't learn about that in medical school. The first one was I remember I went to TED Med with my first company, 2015, and they had a physician who was representing like early microbiome data as it related to the use of steroids in the gut. And I was like, I don't even know what I don't know what the microbiome is. Maybe it was like 2014.
Yeah.
I was like,
yeah.
I don't remember learning that in medical school.
Yeah.
Certainly it was not an ER residency for sure. But, and so that was like a whole rabbit hole for me just to learn about. And then the second one was really getting when the papers started coming out about nanoplastics. Not just, I mean, we all knew like, yeah, probably better to use glass and like avoidance techniques. That was already out for sure. And there certainly were organizations talking about the risks. So I'm not going to, I don't want to devalue all that work that's been going on for decades.
Certainly
plus.
wasn't widely appreciated that there was a risk.
But I think like having papers come out of the New England Journal of Medicine saying we're finding plastics in carotid arteries. And those patients are having more preponderance of strokes and heart attacks retrospectively still, but nonetheless, like real scientifically significant data sets. And we're finding plastics in cranial nerves. Like, well, that means it's crossing the blood-brain barrier. So that's concerning. Yeah. And what's the impact on dementia as it relates to having these, as you probably agree, non-inert substances in our bodies? There's not inert. We have to mostly agree.
I would agree with that. I do want to caution though. I feel like oftentimes the observation gets translated to this is going to kill people, right? We don't know that yet. I mean, I think with the microplastics, yes, it's a concern, and people should do what they can to avoid and reduce, and not, have too much anxiety that these things are gonna cause all sorts of health problems. We just don't know at this point.
That's a totally fair statement.
So do what you can, and I worry a little bit because you're right. I mean, you're right. These things are found in various parts of the body, and I feel like there are in the research world, there are people capitalizing on trying to make headlines because it's also kind of obvious if you go looking for these things and you have a sensitive enough way to find them, you will find them in all parts of the body, right?
Totally.
So going from that to therefore this is causing X is, I think, unfortunately where sometimes the media or scientists who are looking for clicks go.
Yeah, no, that's a fair statement.
And I just want to balance out. Yeah. Yes, we should be pragmatically cautious and not freak out about microplastics at this point.
I love that perspective, and I appreciate you clarifying because I 100% agree with you. I was mostly just stating as it relates to the paper.
Yeah,
but
no, I mean, I think it's important, but I think if we don't give that because of where the popular sort of perception is right now, if you don't give the cautionary side, people don't think of that.
Yeah, no, I think our goal is to shine a light on the industry and say and ask the question, is this a procedure that could potentially reduce those?
And if it does, that's a good thing. Like, again, we don't know how bad these things are, but in general, if you can get them lower, that's a good thing. Let's do it.
Yeah, and what we've learned too, right, is not everyone has the same exposure level. So this isn't like everyone in the world needs plasma exchange to reduce your plastics level, but what we know from the data is occupational exposure matters to some degree. Environment matters. If you're exposed to a bunch of smoke where you're burning plastics, guess what? Well, you're probably
there's probably other stuff in the smoke too, right?
There's a lot of bad stuff in the smoke, right? And so I think it's that's interesting, and just kind of like trying to understand what's the water source. So there's a lot of stuff here, and we are like at the earliest of early stages here to understand not only where are they, but as you stated really well, what's the impact? Maybe there's no impact. And, and I think we're just seeing more podcasts talking about that. I think some of them are fairly done. I thought the drives discussion, that was pretty good, honestly.
Yeah. And again, my intuition is certainly for people who are the outliers in terms of the highest level of microplastics, there are going to be detrimental health consequences associated with that. We already kind of know that. We don't know how bad it is, but we know that's true. For the average person, I think we just don't know at this point. But again, whatever you can do to get those levels down through avoidance or maybe through dilution or other ways, that's probably a good thing.
Well, I wrote a paper in Med City News that just came out this week, actually, that is mostly talking about it from the regulatory perspective. So the other angle I look at it is this is just another avenue of like awareness.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, of course, the best approach is to not ingest and breathe them. Now, I was surprised when I looked at the literature what a high percentage actually could just be from breathing in plastics off of your clothes and other things. So like in my mind, historically, I thought it was, well, I'm not using plastic food containers and I'm drinking water
from plastic water bottles.
Right. But it's more complicated than that. And so I think my sort of write-up was mostly around the notion of how do we start to make progress from a regulatory perspective to protect patients, and not patients, just people in general, as it relates to these exposures, because that's the real answer. And, I don't want to be like a nihilist, or like some people are like, it's just too late. Like I never want to believe it's too late.
Silly.
I mean, it's never too late. Like even if we have plastics in our body, maybe the amount we have is really contextually irrelevant right now, clinically irrelevant. And we'll try and answer that question because we're measuring plastics levels, and we know those patients' chronic diseases or lack thereof. Right. It's some early data for us.
So let's dive into that. So one thing I'm wondering about is the measurement itself. Like, how much confidence do we have? If I want to go get my microplastics measured, how do I do that? And can I is it like the direct to consumer biological age test where it's garbage, or do we have good ways to measure microplastics right now?
Yeah. Well, I have to be a little careful because there's only one real company that, is commercializing it.
Are they doing it direct to consumer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
okay.
So
we won't name them, but if there's only one, I
there's
get why you have to be careful. There's a few ones
coming out, and I've heard there's like 5 or 6 coming. I mean,
do we, I guess the question is, do we know the precision and accuracy of those measurements as they're being given to consumers?
That's a great question. I mean, and as I always say to the people in the industry that are building tests, sorry, I was CMO of a lab testing company.
Yeah.
I have some interest in how good is the test.
Yeah.
And the question is, and to be fair to like the tester on the market, the primary one, the CEO is a fantastic guy. He's been spending his entire career passionate about this topic. So I mean, I think he's doing everything he can to try and answer the questions and make this scale. And before what he developed, there was nothing out there people could even test. But it doesn't mean that we couldn't get better ones. So we've been doing a bunch of research with the Buck Institute specifically to get back to the bench on this, so to speak. And obviously with Eric and in the Buck, we have a really good partner.
Yeah.
We just embarked on a new body of research to look and see, is there a better way to test? And for us, obviously, the first interest is we want to have the most confidence in the test we're doing as it relates to pre and post testing on plasma exchange. But I think more broadly speaking, if there's an opportunity to make a better test, maybe it's too expensive for commercial consumption. Like, who knows? That's not our primary target here. It's just to be very confident in the data.
Yeah. No, that's great. And again, I'm not trying to pick on microplastics. I think all of the direct to consumer tests run into this challenge, right? Which is that the way they typically aren't regulated right now, the incentive structures to run a successful business make it very hard to also do everything as scientists we would want to see around how accurate is it, how much variation is there, technical replicates, things like that, right? So it's just a real problematic consumer space in diagnostics right now, I think.
Yeah. And I was just down at a plastics lab this last week in University of New Mexico, Matt Campin's lab, and just like seeing the work they're doing. And there's like a whole nother layer of people who've been thinking about this from an environmental exposure perspective for a very, very long time. And so I just think, again, surrounding myself with people who know a lot more than me, just trying to find the people who have been thinking about plastics forever and answering the question, are we looking at this from the right angle? What are the potential clinical implications? Which is a whole other area we need more data on. Like, what does it matter if your plastics level is mid-range? We'll just call it that for like a better language. But and what should we do about it? Or should we do anything about it?
Still really early days for sure.
Oh yeah.
So going back to TPE and microplastics, I think from a just conceptual perspective, really easy to understand. If you have plastics in your circulation, you remove 75% of your plasma, you're going to reduce the plastics in circulation by something close to that, right? That makes perfect sense. Does that fit the data that you've seen so far?
Yeah, I think it does. The question that we had to answer first is, do we believe the plastics are going to be in the plasma segment?
Why wouldn't they be? Because they're in cells, you mean?
Or they're attached to cells. They're more dense. because it's just a centrifuge. So density is going to potentially matter there. And we didn't really know for sure because no one actually had answered that question.
Right.
We found one paper on it. I sent it to the Buck. They called me the next day and said, well, 75% of the references are not findable. They're not real, and you're
Yikes.
like, and they were like, and we ran the way that they described it in the paper, and it didn't work. And I was like, okay, I believe you all. So let's find another methodology. So I think there's a bunch of opportunity there, but yeah, we wanted to kind of answer the question: do we believe it's in the area of the blood that could be effectively removed with plasma exchange at scale? We have the largest data set, I'm confident now, in the world really on this topic in humans. And so we'll be releasing the actual data hopefully in the next few months, at least in some sort of abstract format, just to get it out there. Okay. And the data looks encouraging. It's not, I think that what we'll have to figure out is like, I think that in everything we do, there's probably laws of diminishing return here as well. So if your level is low when you start out, like,
and as you know, I mean, I've posted it on social media, so I've been open about my own data. When I did my TPE, my microplastics before, I think was 1, and after it was 5, right? And you told me we now have the 30-day out, so I don't know what that looks like yet. But I came in, at about as low end of the range as you can. In somebody who's at the low end, you're not going to expect to see a reduction, right? I don't know if that bump was real from the plastics in the tube or not, but it was minimal, right? Yeah. Regardless.
Well, that's always the question: is a 1 different than a 5 different than a 10? Truly?
Right. Which gets to the precision and accuracy question, right?
I know. Yeah, exactly. But you're right. And obviously we think there may be it's unclear, but one of the questions we want to answer: do we think the tubing matters? So that's one of the conversations I was having on this recent lab visit was, do we think it really matters? Yeah. Because other people have been looking at this.
Well, like in my case, again, if we assume the test was accurate, going from 1 to 5, probably, even if that's a real thing, is meaningless. That's still very, very low based on the scale that you've got, right?
And maybe 1 to 20 doesn't matter clinically. Like,
right.
Who knows?
I mean, again, I don't know enough, so I probably shouldn't even speculate, but I'm going to. My intuition is until you get into the hundreds, it probably doesn't matter.
Yeah, the high range is certainly probably the most concerning. And I have your data, but I can't say it on air because that would be a HIPAA violation.
You can say it. I give you permission.
Yeah. So, one of the things we were doing with you, obviously, was let's look at 30-day. Yeah. And it was still low. So not surprising, but it's interesting. But I think, again, it's like my theory is, well, you're drinking, you're a careful human baseline.
Moderately, though. Although, I would say I'm not religious about avoiding plastics, right? I mean, I try to do what's pragmatic and practical. I use a metal water bottle, right? I typically don't drink from plastic bottles, although I do sometimes. So, I'm not somebody who is what I would consider over the top paranoid about microplastics. I eat a clean diet. That probably helps. And I don't know, I must have low environmental exposures for reasons I don't understand, right? It's just, that's my situation. Or I'm good at clearing them. That's the other thing. We don't really know. Like some people, there are going to be differences in how effectively people can clear microplastics from their bodies.
And, you and I, being in Seattle, are drinking glacier water for the most part.
Yeah, right.
Right. And so what's glacier water versus groundwater?
And our air quality is usually pretty good, except during forest fire season. Right. So all those things play in. Yeah, exactly.
100%. So we're very excited. I think the data we'll most likely want to focus on is what's the impact of plasma exchange on the mid-range level? What's the plasma exchange impact on high range levels? And again, you won't probably see us like causing alarms and, my physician colleagues would throw, virtual daggers at me if like patients started showing up everywhere freaking out about their plastics numbers.
Right.
But it will be the first data set to come out about a therapeutic option. There may be others that develop. There's some interesting, I get a lot of emails about some of them.
I'm sure.
I'm not certain which ones are real or not, but I'm not going to get involved in that and just wish them luck.
Yeah.
And go from there. But
cool. Yeah. That's really interesting. So have you had any experiences? I mean, you mentioned the patient with long COVID, that was sort of striking to you, right? That they feel better. Are there any other situations like that where you just anecdotally, even if it's N of 1, where you're like, wow, that really seems interesting or impressive?
Well, I have many stories of patients who, and even in a study we had, patients who had significantly higher biological age reductions, not to get into those details, but who are convinced, people who've been monitoring their biomarkers religiously for years, who are full believers in the impact. So there's certainly opportunities. And like the question is, why does someone get more of impact than others? Is it genetic? Is it exposures? Is it habits? Like all the above? Who knows? I mean, it's probably all the above. But then in the chronic disease side, so we talked a bit about the toxin side. That's interesting. I don't have data yet to really correlate like symptomatic toxin. I've gotten a lot of, one of the things that's happened now last year is people begin to know about our name and our brand is we get inbounds from patients to the website all the time. We also get clinics who are interested in bringing a plasma exchange, but a lot of patients who think it may be beneficial to them, and they're generally pretty forthcoming with, I have this toxic mold problem. Do you think that will work? And so there's like more questions and answers, but there's more and more clinics that are taking care of these patients anyway who want to bring plasma exchange in. And that's really like, I think the benefit of our model. We're not out there building clinics ourselves. Right. We're able to really scale fast and very broadly and go into a clinic, and they don't have to even be that busy. We could service them one day a week if their patient population is lower, and still make an impact and start to answer questions and still collect data as it relates to whatever the thing is they're passionate about looking at as it relates to plasma exchange.
So what's the limiting factor right now for clinics bringing a device into their clinic?
Mostly us. Like, clinics come to us, they want to bring it on. Our model is we bring the nurse, the machine, the supplies, right. All the training. We have physician experts, nurse experts, basically everything. And we have to get machines. So now we're buying machines ahead of time, so we don't have to wait for the manufacturer to ship them. And we've like reduced all of these things, as much as we can. My CEO he ran Amazon Prime in his previous life, so he understands a lot about supply chain management and optimization. So much smarter than me on those stuff. So we're figuring all that out. So, and not only does it help like the clinic experience, which is one of the experiences we care about, because we know that trickles down into the patient experience,
of course,
but also just in terms of how fast can we bring up more clinics, bring more clinics on board.
Yeah. And I mean, you sort of alluded to this already. It's a pretty expensive procedure from the patient perspective. I'm sure you get people telling you that all the time. Why is that? I guess the cost is between $5,000 and $10,000 depending on the clinic, but why is it so expensive? And do you see that changing in the future? Or do you think it will always be something that, is in the thousands of dollars?
Yeah. I think the unfortunate part of it, at least for now, like I love to own everything in the supply chain, but I could definitely lower it.
Yeah, sure. Right. No, I get it. That wasn't meant to be critical at all. It's just a reality.
The machines are expensive. The supplies are ridiculously expensive per procedure. Albumin's expensive. Nurses are, not saying they aren't worth what they pay them. They are. They're, we hire the best nurses out of hospitals and take them out of the hospital. So we're not hiring people with a 2-day training course. We're hiring people that have 15 years of experience, because we're the first company doing this outpatient approach. And we think safety and quality is paramount to our brand and for patient outcomes, of course. So that's all expensive, unfortunately. Now we are finding ways to reduce. We've actually lowered our price twice already in the last year, because as we scale, we can find economies of scale that are allowing us to lower that. And hopefully we'll see prices lower in the market. What's interesting is the clinics are really getting creative, like package deals, which I think is important. Like you want patients to get a couple. If you're looking at mercury, well, probably not one. You want to kind of be able to monitor them. So they're, getting more creative about incorporating labs and other components of their programs into it, and then just putting TP in that. And I think that's a really good engagement tool. It allows us to kind of answer the questions faster. So the short answer is yes, we're working on it. And I'm very confident in time with scale, we can continue to lower that. As we grow, I've looked at things like, do we need to acquire parts of the supply chain? Can we control more of that? What's the machine situation? There's only 2 machines you can currently use in the US, but we've been approached by other companies that want to come in market. So, competition will lower the price.
Right. Yeah. And like anything, I'm sure, there's going to be economies of scale as this becomes more and more common. Yep. But even still, I don't know, I'd be interested to know whether you think this will ever be something that the average person can afford, or that insurers will cover for broader use.
I think we can lower the price so that the out-of-pocket expense in time gets to the point where 10x the population can get this with out-of-pocket.
Yeah. And just right now, were my numbers right? Ballpark 5,000 to 10,000 per session?
About 6 to 10 for the most part. Some people are up. Again, it gets more complicated to figure it out because they're bearing it in packages, which
sure.
so you're like, well, I don't know what component of plasma exchange is part of that.
Right.
But I think the long game, we looked at this in previous companies, is, the first step is get the data. If we get the data, the largest data set on some specific disease process, we can take that to get a code and say that, plasma exchange for X. And then ultimately the long pole then is, if we can prove that it works, we have the clinical data to suggest it works for a specific syndrome or disease process, we can get the payers to start to pay. Now, we won't even dig into what the depths of that conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast.
That's like hours, but that's obviously the long pole is, but we have to have the data first, and we are in the first inning of the 9-inning game here, so to speak. So
yeah, okay. So let's speculate a little bit. I realize that you're going to be as uncomfortable doing this as I am when people ask me to do it. But I mean, if you had to speculate, like, what do you think the impact on health span and lifespan could be from TPE alone?
Interesting. Well, I would answer it probably two ways. One, I don't think it ever lives alone in a lot of ways. Yeah. A lot of the work, we have other research going on with different clinics inside and now outside of the US regulatory environment. And one of the things we know about plasma exchange, to what we've talked about, is it's really dampens down the immune system, to put it bluntly and not articulately. Mm-hmm. But when you do that and you're pairing it with other therapies, there's potential there as an adjunctive therapy where TPE, and I think will see this in the next decade, TPE plus X or Y.
Okay.
Or so
interesting, because that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
If you could pair it with something else, what would that be?
Oh, yeah. Well, the ones I think are most impactful, I can't say because we may be already kind of heading down those roads.
Okay.
But the reality is, all the stuff that's being talked about, all the stuff that's being looked at. The question is, from an immunosuppressive perspective, not really immunosuppression, but dampening the immune system to allowing the body to manage other kinds of molecules or
therapies. Like, I mean, again, I'm sure you guys have thought of this, but one that has always interested me, because rapamycin in many ways has a similar effect on immune function. It just kind of tamps down the chronic inflammation component, right? Is presumably stem cell therapies are going to work better if you could knock down the chronic inflammation in an old age tissue, right? So things like that, where there's potential synergies, if you can get that immune dampening effect, and then you put another intervention that would benefit from not having a lot of chronic inflammation. Right?
And I think that's the next 5 years what you're going to see a lot of. Certainly, as stem cells increases in popularity and in regulatory acceptance. So.
Yeah. Well, this is a different conversation, but my hope is that stem cells will become better regulated, so we actually get data instead of just a bunch of people talking about, how outstanding their stem cell success rate has been, right? So that's really interesting to think about. Okay, so for yourself, how many times have you had therapeutic plasma exchange, and what have you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I've had it 5 or 6 times now. So I usually get it about every 3-4 months, depending how busy I am with travel.
Yeah, I hear you.
That's sort of my cadence. Now, I obviously am afforded this luxurious opportunity to go back and get it whenever I want, frankly. But all my biomarkers are improved. When I get it, some people feel significantly better after getting it for the week or two after. Now, when people ask me that, I'm saying you should not expect that, because not everyone gets any sort of subjective energy bump from it. And that's not what we're selling.
Yes.
I typically am a little more tired when I go to bed that night. I don't know if
that was exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the only thing I can say with certainty, other than it was easy, like it wasn't a painful or challenging procedure, was I slept like a rock, like way, way deeper it felt than a typical night's sleep the night after getting it.
That's probably the most common thing we hear from patients.
Yeah.
I slept great. And then they have varying levels of energy in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And so that's I experienced some of that, but I'm not one of those high energy responders, but I definitely get that nice sleep. And my markers have improved. I'm really excited about that. My plastics levels were one better than yours. It was 0 actually when I did mine pre-treatment.
And did it go up a little bit post-treatment?
Yeah, it was like 1 or 2 or something. Yeah, I was just like, I don't know what that means. Yeah. But and so like I'm seeing improvement in my homocysteine levels, lipid markers, the things I actually am most interested in. Yeah. And I'm not seeing any significant impact. Of course, I have to get cystatin C because of the creatinine issue that I have with that. So, but I'm always watching my GFR, looking at things like that nature. I want to start doing more cognitive testing. one of the cool areas of work that we get to do, again, I feel like a kid in the candy store sometimes, is partner with other really interesting technologies to look at what the potential impact of plasma exchange is.
Yeah.
We didn't publish the data, but we did a trial with Kernel. And I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the helmet.
Yeah.
I call it a helmet. I don't know what Ryan, the CEO, would say about that, but I don't know what the right proper term is for it. But and so there's other technologies that we can take into the clinics and in partnership. And so we've got some interesting research going on with Kernel. That's interesting.
Have you guys ever, this just occurs to me because I've had Joel Jameson out a couple times recently, and he's like one of the pioneers in heart rate variability and how to measure that and what it means. And have you ever looked at any data on HRV and TPE impact on that?
We haven't, mostly from a data compliance perspective. One of the things we're trying to solve right now, we just released a product called Circulate 360. And so that is where we start to build some software backend to the work we do and create the opportunity, especially for patients who want us to answer these questions. All these clinics live in their own space. They don't.
I know that's a big problem.
Yeah, they're all agnostic or in competition.
It's not a problem. It's just a limitation to really understanding what works and what doesn't work.
Well, the addressable market of longevity patients is not massive. I mean, it's massive, but it's not. It still has limitations. And as we're seeing massive growth in clinics, they don't want to lose their patients, which is totally reasonable. So
I actually don't think it is. I think there's way more patients than there are good clinics that can serve them right now.
That's a fair statement.
But I know other people who are very who are maybe more concerned about competition have other opinions on that. I just think there's so much room for good people in this space right now.
I totally agree.
Nobody has to worry about not having enough patients if you do a good job.
Oh my goodness. I agree. And I mean, and that's why when I looked at what model I wanted to take this company forward with, I was like, I don't want to build clinics. I want to work with the best clinics in the country and learn from them and partner with them. And so once we get this back-end product really robustly built, we're going to start collecting passive data for the clinics that are willing to partner with us. And we will, if we publish data, we will shine a light on that clinic. That's kind of like the methodology we're applying against this. And I think we will scale much faster with the data collection that way. But you're right, HRV is a really interesting area. And all these patients are getting the data. They already have it. The question is, how do we get it from them? And so we're just getting a bunch of data from one clinic that was basically like, we have so much data and we don't have the time. And so we're going to partner with Circulate, the Buck, and this clinic to like really get into their data set. TP and otherwise, they're doing broad-based testing. So I'm super excited about those kinds of partnerships with the clinics beyond just us being a service organization that's doing the plasma exchange for them.
Cool.
A much broader arrangement and agreement with them.
I think that's great. So this may not be fair, but I'm going to ask it anyways. If you had to bet your life on one intervention outside of lifestyle, would it be TPE?
Oh, interesting. Wow. Wow. Well, I think that the issue is how in my lifetime, how fast do I believe there will be other options there, more targeted approaches to healthspan or living? And I think for the foreseeable future, I'm not certain about that. And even when those are developed, I think that they're going to likely be better in combination with plasma exchange. So I think the place we may end up long-term is not jumping up and down and saying all you need to do in your life is plasma exchange. We're not even saying that now, but I think the plasma exchange may be a part of a common regimen for healthspan approach as we're like looking at adjunctive therapy, stem cell, and otherwise. There's some interesting, obviously, proteins and things that are coming out there. I'm not even going to say the word exosomes without raising your blood pressure, but
my blood pressure's fine. Although we should come back to exosomes at some point.
So I think that I think that's really where it is that plasma exchange will continue to prove out that it's really important for healthspan. I think we'll be able to continually prove out has an impact on toxin removal and a variety of chronic diseases. Yeah. And then should people stop there? Probably not.
What's your gut feeling in terms of, I mean, I tend to agree with you, just speculating. We don't know. We're both say that right now, but I tend to agree with you that there's a lot of potential for therapeutic plasma exchange. What's your intuition as to the fraction of the population that would be likely to see significant benefits? Because again, I think we're probably both agreed there's going to be a subset of people who are pretty dialed in with the things that TPE can do, who while they might get a minimal benefit, aren't going to really see anything significant. Do you think it's like 25%, 50%, 90%? I know this is speculation, but I'm interested to know kind of where you land.
Well, I think that if we talked about plasma exchange in the healthspan / longevity cohort, and we take care of patients that are much younger than the trial was, those are patients who are really invested in healthy living. And we're seeing drops in alcohol consumption, all these things we know. And so the question is, well, for those patients who are investing in their health span over a broad, decades, is there a benefit to plasma exchange? And I think there is. So that's some percentage of the total population. So, and then what we don't know is what percentage of the chronic diseases. I mean, we're seeing this inversion of aging within the U.S. population, really globally. And in my perspective is global. As we move into these global markets, we're taking care of patients in different countries.
And do you guys have clinics now outside the U.S. that you're in?
We just in the last month have signed 4.
Okay.
They're not live yet because that takes a little bit of spin up. But yeah, so and that's one of our big areas of interest is capturing data coming from, as you know, when we talk about like different countries have different approaches to public health, which will trickle down into different chronic disease phenotypes. So we want to be like across the world. I think that's really where we can shine is like once the data collection mechanisms in place, we can partner with the Buck, maybe, other institutions like Singapore, the other ones I'd love to target, frankly, and continue to build that scientific rigor around it and then accelerate the science as fast as we can.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit, because I mean, it's an interesting space, I'm sure, for you to be in as CEO of a company that's offering, I mean, it's an FDA, what's the word? Not approved, cleared, FDA cleared, device, but for experimental usage, right? I mean, outside of what it's FDA cleared for. And I view that very much like off-label use of rapamycin or other interventions. But we're in a space where people are doing things that are much more extreme, I would say, if you think of it as a continuum from, not regulated supplements to FDA cleared or approved approaches to, offshore gene therapy on secret islands, right? Or injections in vendor halls at conferences, right? I'm just interested to know kind of how you think about that, how you navigate the space. And I mean, RadFest, I think, is a really interesting example. You and I were both there. We saw a lot of stuff. Some of it really good, some of it more questionable, but Circulate was a vendor there. And that's not at all critical. LabCorp was a vendor there. Other very reputable companies were vendors there. And there were vendors there that were doing stuff that were questionable, I would say. So how do you think about the space in that context?
I mean, I have this sort of regulatory background with my previous work. My first company, we built an FDA-approved ultrasound machine when there was no 510K for it. There was no predicate devices. It was like, how do you prove that the screen on a mobile phone is as good as a medical monitor? That's like the work we had to do legitimately to get that product out.
Right.
So I've struggled, and not a struggle, but honored and understood a lot of this regulatory environment. The first thing I did when I took the job was spend as much time with one of the best regulatory firms in the country, Covington, to help me understand this environment, specifically for what we were going into here.
And it's a complicated, I mean, the regulatory environment is complicated.
Oh, right? Yeah. And like, you need expert help there. And we, fortunately, like that's what I spent my first 2 months doing. We weren't commercializing. I was spending time on the regulatory approach, a variety of things like that to make sure I understood the landscape of where we were going to head before we started walking and running forward. So I think that, but I think with my physician hat on, and we see this even in the context of me being an emergency medicine physician, where do people go if they don't know where to go? The emergency department, right? They just don't know where to go. But now I've learned a different perspective on that. Where do patients go when traditional medicine has essentially abandoned them? Functional medicine clinics, people who are willing to spend 2 hours with the patient, right? And they're willing to pay for it. They're willing to pay for it. They're just looking for doctors who are willing to listen to them and operate a little bit outside the traditional framework of reimbursement even, right? And so that learning and seeing these physicians that we work with now is actually really inspiring. And talking to those patients who are like, I had nowhere else to go until I started with practice X or practice Y. I mean, in these debilitated syndromic patients who essentially don't fall in the traditional framework. I mean, if they came to the ED, we'd be like, I don't know, I don't know what to do with this. Cause like, I can't get any more imaging. I can't do any more labs. There's just nothing here. And, you sympathize for those patients when they do come in. You want to help them, obviously. And I think that's most physicians are in the practice of wanting to be helping patients.
Absolutely.
And So I think that both seeing the physicians and getting the fortunate opportunity to partner with some of these really pioneering physicians and getting the opportunity to talk to the patients who are not only impacted by plasma exchange, but by the overall experience in general for people willing to look at what's the role of heavy metals potentially in my chronic disease processes, when otherwise I just sit at home and don't know where to go next. So that I think from that perspective, I don't feel like we're experimental. I think we're off label in the context of what we're doing with plasma exchange, but I think it's the right thing to do. And I think it's the right mission for the company is to provide outpatient opportunities to allow physicians to prescribe off-label treatments that they think are going to be helpful for their patients, whatever they believe, and start to answer the questions that traditional medicine will never, ever answer. They just won't get to it.
Yeah.
I don't know of a single trial going on in the traditional medicine circle that answers any of the questions that we're looking at right now. I wish they were.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's been one of my ongoing sources of frustration that we don't get the trials that could actually answer these questions. So yeah, I'm right there with you.
I remember when Jamie Haywood brought out Patients Like Me back in the day, in the early days of digital health, allowing patients to self-experiment on a variety and then share that data to create data sets, right?
Right.
I always remember that notion because we're not patients like me at all, but we are collecting data from patients who are looking for some answers. And I think that from that perspective, we do have some similarity there.
Great. I think that's a great concept to end on. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to touch on that you think is important?
No, thanks. I think we covered a lot here today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming down today. This has been fascinating, and I'm looking forward to continuing to see where things go with Circulate and with Therapeutic Plasma Exchange.
I appreciate you having me on the show. It's my pleasure.